Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar. This is a webinar with WXN in partnership with the Colbourne Institute for Inclusive Leadership and as part of NorQuest College. And today we present What's EDI Got to Do with It? Demystifying Psychological Safety and Equity in the Workplace. I'm Virginia Johnson. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at WXN, Women's Executive Network. We are a one-of-a-kind community that brings together thousands of bold women, allies, and corporate members in a rich and diverse ecosystem of professional development, networking, thought leadership, belonging, and celebration that propels professional women to rise and lead. And we are so pleased to have you all join us today. So to start off, I want to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples whose presence continues to enrich our communities. And WXN holds a presence in Toronto, which is part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty as a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Now, we realize that some of you may not be in the territory that we are acknowledging today, and so we do ask that you take that responsibility to acknowledge your traditional territory and the current treaty holders of your lands. Thank you. And now for our topic. In today's workshop, we'll explore the complexities and nuances of psychological safety in the workplace and the challenging conversations that may come from that. This will include a discussion on power, privilege, and influence, and how these factors relate to atmospheres of psychological safety, especially in the current political climate. Joining us today for this topic is Dr. Zena Sleeman, and Zena holds a PhD in political science and a master's in global politics. She has over 15 years of experience leading data-driven projects and focuses on the understanding the impact of diversity and how to create more inclusive spaces. As the director of the Colbourne Institute, Zena's role is to lead the team of developers and consultants in delivering high-quality professional development training. Her role also includes creating a vision for establishing innovative framework in helping organizations create more inclusive spaces, whether it's through research, training, or community development. And when she's not working, you'll find Zena reading, writing, and spending time with her children while working on various crafts. She is also the author of an upcoming novel, Where the Jasmine Blooms, and is working on her second book. And with that, welcome, Zena.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I have to update that bio because the book has been out, actually. It came out in April.
Amazing.
Which is, after I sent that bio. So note to everyone here. Thank you so much for that, and welcome everyone for joining us today. I want to start also by acknowledging that I'm located in Treaty 6 territory, which is also known as Amiskwasiwaskahikan, also known as Edmonton. And for me, land acknowledgements have often been about creating a safe space for Indigenous participants and Indigenous communities who attend these events, but also for a collective acknowledgement that I recognize and I acknowledge the colonial and violent history of Canada and other regions. And also that I am a guest on this land and that I'm grateful for the openness and the welcoming and the openness and the welcomes that I've received from many Indigenous communities here in Canada. So on that note, Virginia already did kind of a debrief on what this workshop will focus on, so I won't get too deep into that. I'll start a little bit by just kind of talking a little bit about psychological safety, and then we'll get into some strategies for developing it, some issues, and I've got a few toolkits and assessments that I'll be sharing with everyone here. I think, Virginia, there's the people can pose their questions in the Zoom side. I have dedicated some time at the end of the workshop for discussion and questions. So we'll go through those as we move along. But also, if you have questions like in the moment as well, I'm happy to take those as well. So it doesn't have to wait until the end of the session. Okay, let's get started. So psychological safety in the workplace, what is it? I think a lot of people misunderstand this for a variety of things. Like everyone has the ability to sort of exist and have opinions and all those things are true. But psychological safety isn't about being nice, which often I think it gets misinterpreted as. It's about the ability to give candid feedback, openly admitting mistakes, and learning from each other. This is from Dr. Amy Edmondson. She's got this book, The Fearless Organization, which some of you are already familiar with. She's a scholar at Harvard who did an extensive study with a variety of organizations throughout different sectors and looked at the characteristics and the features and the indicators of psychological safety and sort of put it together in this book. So you can find her content everywhere, and a lot of the work I'll be discussing in this presentation is driven from her. So really, it's about creating workplaces that allow people to be their full selves, have the confidence and safety to ask questions, give feedback, and establish workspaces that are lower stress and more engaging. Amy Edmondson has a presentation, you can find it, it's a TED Talk, where she talks about a case of a nurse who is looking at sort of the guidelines for giving a patient medication, and she notices that the dosage is a little bit higher than it should be. She considers calling the doctor to ask for clarification, and then she remembers how the last time she did this, she was ridiculed for being incompetent, let the doctors make those decisions. So she does not call the doctor and moves forward with giving the patient that higher dose of medication. This is an example of what would be characterized as an unpsychologically safe space. And the reason why I'm using a bit of this dramatic example of like the nurse and this patient with, higher dose medication is that sometimes it can have really severe consequences. In the case of in the healthcare field, for example, like people facing illnesses or dying. In other situations, it could mean not meeting certain project outcomes or not innovating as quickly and efficiently as an organization could. So when we think of the tech sector, and Dr. Edmondson did a lot of work in with Google, for example, looking at how innovative teams create ideas and broker new projects. So the reason why I'm bringing this up again is because the stakes can be quite high with spaces that are not psychologically safe, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. But this is what it's really about. And is also quite a bit of research around how organizations that are psychologically safe just exceed results. And I'll have some statistics further down in the presentation, so I'll elaborate on it a little bit. So what psychological safety is not, it's not about just being nice or conflict avoidance. In fact, a lot of the time it's the opposite. It's about meeting conflict head on, but developing a strategy for navigating those conflicts and difficult conversations. It is not necessarily about consensus decision making. It is possible that some decisions might be made within an organization or an institution that maybe not everybody is going to agree with, and that's okay. Again, it's about communication and having those difficult conversations. Psychological safety is also not about oversharing. So again, when we think about in the context of the workplace, is this about a place where you can sort of come in and start talking about all of your childhood trauma and issues and being given free rein to do that? No. It is also not a place where all ideas will necessarily be supported. I think that's also an unrealistic thing as as organizations increase in size, that's just not going to be the case. And so, again, we're gonna lean into how to navigate all these things when decisions aren't necessarily all being supported, when consensus isn't necessarily the approach to make a decision or develop a new policy or etc. Here are some signs of a workplace that lacks psychological safety. So employees who don't ask questions or ask for help. For example, you task a team to develop a new project, you got new funding, and the project manager then goes off and starts to develop the work. 6 months down the line or 8 months down the line, you realize the project hasn't even started. And when you reach out to the project manager, they tell you that they hadn't received a list of the outcomes for the project. that person was afraid to approach their leader and ask questions around those outcomes. And there you have employees who are not asking questions. And again, leading to some of those really more extreme consequences of work and projects and depending on the fields that everyone here works in. A lot of the time, new ideas are mocked, ignored, used against employees, stolen, or shut down. Again, that example of the nurse who was mocked when she first brought up the the concern over a patient having a dosage that's a little bit higher. New ideas. Oh, that's a double, so ignore that one. And there's also high turnover. People leave, and I know that a lot of the time this is sort of top of mind for a lot of businesses, especially some of the smaller and medium-sized businesses that we work with. They're always worried about turnover. They're worried about recruiting good talent, and this is a huge indicator of an unpsychologically safe space. Staff will often hide their diversity. So, for example, I'm a mom, and there were many times where I had to leave early to pick up my kids, or my kids got sick, or whatever. Are the are your staff being open about that? And that's just a reality of life. If you have an unpsychologically safe space, what often happens is that staff might lie, might, pretend like something else is going on, might also neglect some of their personal duties or family duties in order to appease their workplace or their employer. In meetings, we'll also see executive dominating meeting discussions. So staff who are not at the senior leadership level are remain quiet and aren't given opportunities to voice their concerns, ideas, or thoughts. uh, Feedback is not given or requested. So again, that hierarchy of power and authority within an organization is super clear. Um, and then staff don't own up to mistakes. So when an error is made, that it's hidden, or people are afraid to even voice those mistakes. Dr. Edmondson talks about this as well, of creating a culture of failure, or not necessarily a culture of failure where like we're seeking failure, but creating a culture where failure is okay, because a lot of the time innovation and new ideas come from experimentation, and you cannot experiment without instances where failures happen. And so how do we create a space where people feel like, okay, they tried something innovative, a new project or a new idea, and it wasn't as successful as they thought they were. That's really valuable data for future project and future work. But if the space isn't established to allow staff to even experiment because that fear of failure is there, we kind of fall in this space of complacency. Um, I had a coworker who used to throw failure parties. And so like if they had submitted a grant for a project and it didn't come through, they would just have this party and just celebrate that failure, because now they had this idea. Now they had all these resources. Now they know they tried to put together this project and it didn't work out, so they can shift their attention elsewhere. All right, I want us to take a moment, and I think there's a lot of people here who are probably from different industries. So I would love to hear like which industries people are coming from, and then I want us to take a minute. So Virginia will create a breakout for groups of about 4 to 5. We're 17, so I don't know. We'll do the math on what that looks like, and just have a discussion around a time where you were hesitant to speak up with an idea, a mistake, or an issue. And I want you to all think about what held you back. And then we're gonna take that and come back. And I want to have a chat a little bit about what that looks like in your respective workplaces and in your respective industries.
Okay, so I'm just going to put you in breakout rooms with what held you back. And we are going to be in there for 7 minutes. So I will open all rooms.
Welcome back, everyone. Virginia, I'll wait for your cue.
Yep, they're good now. They're all
Okay.
back.
Okay, great. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So I'd like to hear a little bit about you can either drop it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself, and maybe if there's a few people, just raise your hand. But I'd like to hear a little bit about a summary of like the things that held you back from sharing an idea, a mistake, or an objection, or even sharing, new strategies. I love that we've got a nice variety of industries. So like I see wildlife here. I saw arts, insurance, hospitality. And again, sometimes in these industries, the stakes can be a lot higher.
Yeah, especially the wildfire one. I'm sure that that's a very high,
Yeah.
intense industry.
In our group, a couple things were mentioned, and we didn't get time to speak to the last person, so apologies for that. But one person indicated being in the military, feeling that they had to accommodate to the senior leadership and not maybe have a voice. Another person indicated that they were part of an arts area, and how do you support different artists when things can be political versus not, and or identity based versus not. And then the example that I brought up was a simple case of not wanting to post my photo on company directory until people got to know me, because I didn't want to have presumptions made um, in regards to myself being a woman of color, a woman of a certain age, etc. Um, so those were some examples of things that we heard in our group.
I love that. Thanks, Andrea. Would anybody else like to share? Okay, and that's okay. I think there's you know, I think it's also important to recognize, Andrea, and like in your example of like not wanting to share your picture, there are also instances where the the politics and the just the power dynamics that exist in our society, so not even just in our workplace, actually merit for certain populations to protect ourselves even further than normally would. And sometimes that's not necessarily like a psychologically safety thing, and it's more about a personal safety, right? And a recognition that, you know, it's a sort of an acknowledgement of the reality of that society, or perhaps the demographics and the populations that you work with, for example. And so I think that's one piece. The other thing I was going to say is, the comment around, accommodating senior leadership. Obviously, that really speaks to an environment of like where, going back to like going to a meeting where like executives dominate the conversation, and opinions or input aren't being asked of in different areas. And so, and we'll get to that, but that speaks to a very clear power dynamic. So there is a fear of people feeling like they'll get fired. And, I guess in the military, it's other types of reprimands. I'm not familiar with the power structures in the military, not in detail anyways. And to mitigate that, we're talking about some like significant culture shifts, right? And so so I just wanted to make a couple of those notes there. Anybody else want to share anything, comments based on what I just said, or again, some things that were in the chat before we move into the next section? Okay. So, we primarily work at the Colbourne Institute in the area of leadership, and particularly as it connects with equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we talk about a lot of these things in the realm of equity. And a lot of the time people will ask like, if this is just about leadership, or this is just about psych safety, or, whatever it is that they are looking. We do a lot of data analytics, for example. We do a lot of research around engagement. And again, there's this often question of like, well, we already do all this stuff. Why do I need to collect all this like EDI related stuff? And it's because it's all connected. And like, if we're not collecting some of that really important data, then we're missing a very obvious angle to understanding inclusion in your workplace. And a lot of the time it's really about that. It's about understanding, a lot of organizations will do like work in engagement, for example, but they don't collect race-based data, or they don't collect identity-based data. So how are you then acknowledging and realizing the reality that perhaps people who come from equity-seeking groups might experience these things within your organization differently than the majority does? And so things like experiencing bias, discrimination, prejudice, harassment, racism all have a negative effect on psychological safety in the workplace. They're all related. There was a study done in the United States and I'll have to find the citation for this, but that found that Black employees felt significantly higher mental well-being working from home during the COVID pandemic because they weren't having to go to the workplace and experience microaggressions on a daily basis. They were just in the safety of their home. So these are things that there are a variety of things within the psychologically safe framework that are also uniquely experienced by people from equity-seeking groups. And if we're not collecting the data, if we're not doing the analysis that breaks down these experiences by those factors, organizations are really missing a really key point. So, again, things that can impact this are like othering, like when you're constantly asked about like, oh, the food that you bring in or your hair or like, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Or, like, am I oppressed by my father, for example? These are all things that serve to like other people and like put them out of that like framework of inclusion. It can lead to increased stress for many people, unfair treatment, lack of growth opportunities, and then this level of covering and minimization.
So there are quite a few comments that
Oh,
did get typed in. I can read them for you, Zena.
sure.
So some points from one of the groups was awareness of power dynamics, speaking up to executive and senior leadership, not wanting to be labeled as the ones that always object or question, not wanting to be seen as critiquing something, especially as colleagues may have put a lot of effort into the project. One of the reasons discussed from the group is that we sometimes hold ourselves back based on how we would be perceived. Someone who is overly critical or always poking holes or coming off as unapproachable. And then after listening to the shared experiences, it makes me realize how desensitized I've become over the years of the strict adherence to chain of command, resistance to change, and very unwelcoming new ideas. And that was he's retired military, so that was that comment.
Yeah. I always sometimes I often wonder if the wrong people are in these sessions. And because there's two like where I think when it comes to who's responsible for like creating a psychologically safe space and like alleviating some of those things that people are discussing, there's two levels. There's the leadership piece, but then there's the individual piece, right? And even if you're within your own team, like I'm a director, and so I have like senior leadership that I report to, and then I have staff, right? So I can implement and incorporate things within my own area, but how I'm treated by leadership and within the organization, that's sort of like a little bit beyond my ability to change. And there's like this multi-leveled, multi-layered piece. And so, again, I'm reading these things and I'm thinking like, we should get all of your leaders into the room with these things. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit further down of like, how do we create institutions and structures that actually support the creation and attract the people that you want? Because ultimately, we cannot change everyone. And in fact, our approach at the Colbourne Institute has been about we approach equity, diversity, inclusion from a harm reduction perspective. So, and I think especially in today's climate, when there's a lot of resistance to a lot of this work, we often tell people like, I'm not here to necessarily change your values. I'm not here to like, you know, force you to be convicted of otherwise. However, what we do is we identify harm, we identify the barriers, we identify the things that are preventing your organization from thriving. And at the end of the day, we do a lot of strategy work, for example, for organizations. So we would deliver, these barriers and give them guidance and, strategies for improving that. But at the end of the day, it's up to the institution to decide whether or not these harms are going to be mitigated. And sometimes certain people just don't fit in every organization. And that's a leadership decision that has to be made. So, that's a total side tangent, but just speaking to that a little bit. And so I wanted to there was also some research that was done after the pandemic. We saw a lot of like companies bringing people back to work, right? And then there was this, what they called, the Great Resignation. I don't know if that's still happening given the current climate around just, impeding war and how that's going to affect our climate and tariffs and all those things. So, but when this was occurring, particularly after COVID, and people were going more into, especially the younger generations were going into like the gig economy, there was a lot of research trying to find out like, why are people leaving? Why are people quitting? And again, with a lot of, we work primarily with small and medium-sized businesses. That's a huge like thing that's on their mind. It keeps them up at night. Like, why are people quitting? Why aren't people applying to these jobs? And based on some of the research that was collected after the pandemic, there was it came down to four main things. It was low pay, lack of opportunities for advancement, feeling disrespected, not having enough flexibility. Three of those things are tied to psychological safety. Low pay is sort of a different thing, but this also means something else for people who come from equity-seeking groups. 58% of the non-white respondents also said that there was a lack of flexibility as the main reason. This often relates to things like a lot of people who come from immigrant families, for example. I work a lot with newcomers who are often caring for elders, and having that flexibility to, or even work from home, for example, citing that study I did that they did with Black staff and the psychological safety they got just from working from home. The flexibility allows for greater navigation of working around preferences and their work styles. 39% also said they were working too many hours, and that ties into the flexibility. And 48% cited childcare issues. So this comes with diversity of employing women and particularly childcare providers. And so even if who are the women are predominantly the ones who take care of their children or childcare providers, even though I recognize that there are still men who do that as well. But this often affects the ability for women to get back into the workplace or stay in the workplace. So now that we've kind of covered the basis for what psychological safety is and what it looks like from different perspectives, I wanted to kind of shift a little bit into what do we do about it and how do we create these spaces and go into that. I'm just looking at the comments, just making sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, I mean, the harm reduction also makes it like clear for a lot of people, right? That it's sort of, it's just like a clean cut. So it's, again, it's not about like, changing your values. People get really scared when we start talking about equity, especially in this climate again. Like, people are just terrified of the acronym now, right? But then if we talk about how like we're about maximizing opportunities for your organization, and there are people, and I've seen this as well, like people who are legitimately harmed, their psychological mental health is harmed. I mean, in some cases, you're seeing your clients, your patients, your community being harmed as well. How do we identify it and remove it? And this is where the assess and identify piece is so important, because you cannot fix the problem if you don't know what the problem is. And again, we get a lot of like organizations that'll come to us and be like, people keep quitting. I can't seem to hire anybody. Or, a lot of construction companies here in Canada, there's a legislation that if you're building through a Indigenous land, that you have to have, I think it's about 20% of your construction staff have to be Indigenous. And so, but they really struggle with hiring and recruiting and retaining Indigenous construction workers. And so, what is the answer to that question? And we have to figure out, and we have to assess and identify what the issue is within organizations before we can provide targeted approach to that. For a lot of time, when a lot of the EDI work was sort of booming, especially around the incident, George Floyd's murder, we saw a lot of training and workshops going around. Like, organizations were super quick to be like, I need training, give us anti-racism workshops, give us history of racism workshops and equity and all those things. And it was great and wonderful. But a lot of the time it ended there. It was sort of this, come and give us a 2 workshop and we're all anti-racist now and it's all good. And there's been some research on the effectiveness of just workshops, and that they're limited. And in some cases, they can actually be harmful, because then they give the people who attend them a bit of like a green check mark of like, I'm good, I took the training, so I can't be racist. But however, what often works is actually targeted, long-term, slow, progressive work. And here's where the assessment piece is so important. Because if we can assess that, for example, within an organization, your big problem is within HR and the policies that are being implemented and delivered within human resources, that gives us a huge sign and to kind of focus on that area. The training is really important because it provides that knowledge piece, But what do we do with that knowledge piece is where we're going to see that long-term and effective change. And then once we have that data, we can strategize. So we can, if it is an HR policy problem, then we can start talking about the policies. How do we revise them? How do we rewrite them? Train the HR staff to recognize bias in the way that they're filtering applications, in the way that they're posting their applications, in the way that they're even doing interviews, or doing follow-ups, all of those things. And then we will see progress and we will see change. And there is different like assessments out there that organizations can use that are leveled, right? So like, let's say you do an assessment and you're at like level 1, and then you develop a strategy and you start implementing it. You do the assessment in like 2-3 years, you see that you're at a level 2 or level 3. That's great. That's progress. And that is like slow incremental progress will lead to that long-term effective change. And then once we've got that strategy, that's where the implementation comes in, whether it's training, whether it's rewriting those policies, whether it's like changing, really implementing those changes that we talked about, like recruiting differently, targeting different diverse populations, doing your interviews a little bit differently, etc. I'm just seeing a question here about defining harm and what are these harms? That's a great question. And it's so we do an assessment at the Colbourne Institute. It's called Momentum, and basically what it does, and there's multiple harms. So we ask questions around like abuse, for example. Have you experienced abuse in the workplace? We ask questions around stress, so engagement. So we look at, an individual's work-life balance. We look at harassment. We look at all various types of harassment and experiences of discrimination. And then our assessment basically weighs those answers. So it's determined based on the level of harm within these contexts as they relate to workplace psychological safety and equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it is based on a framework that kind of combines both the scholarship around psychological safety and engagement, and also what we know of the harms of racism and discrimination affect people and their mental health. So we took that research and combined it, and that's how we determine those skills. So that's a very brief kind of answer. I'm happy to reach out to me after this workshop. We can chat about it some more. But also even in the way that we deliver our training in our workshops. So for example, when a client comes to us and we're doing an accessibility audit, it's about creating access to individuals with disabilities, right? Again, it's not about telling the leaders and the managers that we all have to change our values and our approach. It's about creating a workspace that is accessible to everyone that you're interacting with and you're engaging with. And that's where that's kind of, again, the framework that we use, right? It's about accessibility, it's about safety. And a lot of the knowledge pieces that we work with are obviously important to understanding that. But given the climate of how things are shifting, again, I feel like this speaks a lot to what works and what resonates with people. And I think it's what matters too, right? Like, I think that if you create an organization where everyone's doing all this training and, we're sharing common values around equity, diversity, and it's being promoted, and it's being postered and all these things, but people keep, leaving, a person out of meetings, or like touching a Black person's hair without their consent. Like, it's just, the harm is still happening. So even if you force everyone to get on board with your values and the things that you're sort of promoting and putting out there, if your staff are still experiencing abuse from their leaders, none of that matters. And so how do we identify whether or not that abuse and that harm is happening? What is it tied to, and how do we eliminate it? Hope that makes sense. Yes, absolutely. Microaggressions are a huge part of that. Yeah, so, love that. Okay. All right. So we developed, so this large assessment that we do with a lot of organization, we sort of developed like a micro version of it. It's super quick, and it's not comprehensive, but it gives organizations a snapshot. So I'm gonna just let you all scan this QR code and try to fill it out based on your knowledge of the organization. Keep in mind that when we do this, we do it with all staff, all leaders, so we get a lot more of a comprehensive look. But still, again, this is always gives companies and organizations and staff like an interesting snapshot into the culture of their organization. So take a few minutes. I'm going to give everyone, I think, let's say I'm going to say 5 minutes to do the assessment, and then we'll circle back and we can talk a little bit about that. Anybody shocked by the results?
I found the question, like, I work from home. Our organization is all work from home, so some of the questions were not necessarily applicable, but they're interesting because there's some things I just never even thought about until you had it in a survey.
Awesome. That's really good perspective too. Around, and we customize this again, like with different clients, like depending on, whether or not they are more work from home or in person. And so, yeah, but sometimes people are like shocked by like the results. And you'll see for the person who asked a question around like what is harm, you'll see some of the examples of some of the questions, right? And those are weighted differently depending on the severity of the harm that is caused. And they're all meant to target accessibility and impact. That's a good question with the NA. Yes and no. So we did for a while provide it with a non-applicable, and that would just sort of push people to not answering the questions, and it sort of like gives us a big gap in data. And so we moved away from that. There are still, and again, when we do this comprehensively with clients, there are still some questions that we will include it in specifically for in certain contexts, but we removed it from this because it sort of removes the ability to understand. And then there are certain things that are kind of like if you don't know the like whether or not staff have access to like religious holidays, for example, if you don't know that, that's also a sign of like transparency and inclusion. So most things can be given kind of translated into an answer. Whereas if you put not applicable, that doesn't tell us like, is that because you just don't know or because you don't have any special holidays? And so there's a huge gap in like the data, which is why we removed a lot of the non applicable piece of the questions. Yeah, so I'll just give everyone a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. For me, I was wondering about some questions where it's like it's easy to talk to leadership or it's easy to. So I think there's a part of like having the ability to just like go and address things, but then it's like how like the response piece is not necessarily in the questions.
Like how leaders respond to you?
Yeah. How to like how are things addressed or something like that. So that's common in terms of like maybe easy, but then it just falls into like nothingness,
Yeah. So there are, I don't know if it was in this chunk of the assessment, but there are also questions around like my opinions are valued and taken into consideration, or my ideas are valued, which is kind of like a bit of that answer piece, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it is valuable. That is valuable knowledge there too. Okay. Any other thoughts? Questions?
I get what you're saying, like kind of with that first question when you mentioned not having an NA.
Yeah.
Because even if you're not, like if you don't know whether there's a policy for accessibility or any example like that, then that's telling right there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So like even if there was a policy, the fact that which is good if there's a policy, but the fact that you don't know if there's a policy is telling because there's not the proper introduction to all the employees that there is this policy in place to help people.
Exactly. And when we do this too, we collect a lot of institutional data. So we'll work with the organization and collect the data around like the availability of all these things. So then we can cross-reference it against the results from the staff survey, which is always super interesting, right? Because when you have like organizations that are like, yeah, we're so good with diversity, et cetera, and then you do the staff survey and it's like, there's a real lack of just self-awareness for the organization. Okay. This is available too. Like, if ever you're curious or you want to share it with your colleagues, you're more than welcome to share that with them as well. We have, this is the one that I showed you here is specifically for like a space and culture domain, but we have one that's overall looks at the organization from an EDI perspective, and that one is on our website. So again, it's available there if you want to share it with your colleagues. Sometimes it's always just interesting to share results and notes there. Yeah. Okay, the other sort of tool that sometimes I like to use with clients and participants in courses and workshops, and Virginia, can you please clarify, we get to go until 12:30, correct? Or 2:30, I guess, your time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
you
Just
still
make sure.
have another, like, just over half an hour. Yep,
Okay, great.
we're good.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so, there's a question around, if I speak, who benefits? And this is a table, and again, I'm happy to share like a fillable version of this that I'll share with Virginia and you can use it. These are example, what's in the table is an example of what could go in there. So for example, if I use my voice to share something, who benefits? Is it the organization or its customers or clients or patients or etc.? When does the benefit occur? After some delay, immediately, never. And then the certainty of benefit. So like if there is a history, for example, of me voicing my concern, and then that's usually not beneficial or sometimes detrimental. And then you go into the remaining silent piece of like, okay, if I remain silent, I will probably benefit because I'll be safe from there. When does the benefit occur? Immediately, because I didn't say anything and I'm good. And then the certainty of that is high. So people will often revert back to the remaining silent. There are different variations of this and cultural factors that and power differentials, right? So depending on your leadership location, so whether you're a senior leader, a middle manager, or somebody who reports to a middle manager, that will differ. But it also says a lot about your relationship to the people around you and how they've sort of responded to those things. Workplace norms. I was in, I had a colleague who who went to work in Japan and he went to teach English there. And this is an extreme example, but it will sort of speak a little bit to that. He was trying to get a job and he kept getting like rejected everywhere. And he was just not, he would getting calls for all these interviews. He would go into these interviews and then they would just no jobs. And so he reached out to a Japanese friend of his and to ask him like, what am I doing wrong? So they did a mock interview. And what he was doing wrong was going into this interview, sharing all his ideas and thoughts around how he could change the classroom and improve the curriculum and etc. And, his friend was sort of like, that's the worst thing you could do. You go in and you kind of give indications that you can obey and follow orders. And so, what are the cultural norms of this organization and how does it shift? And again, that's an extreme case, and that's also speaks to like different cultural standards within a different country in a different space. But that'll differ depending on, where you are. A lot of what we talk about with regards to psychological safety and EDI is really primarily applicable to like North America and Europe, and it would be very different if I were giving this workshop elsewhere, and so keep that in mind. But again, culture of the organization matters. If there is a history, for example, of people using their voices and being shut down, that creates a certain tone within the organization. The other thing that differentiates is the need for another factor is a need for social acceptance, for example. Are you somebody who has really high desire for just social acceptance? You might revert back to staying silent because the impact is immediate and the certainty of benefit is high. But there's also a really big opportunities that could be missed there. So, so this is just a really good tool, and you can use it and you can sort of fill it out with your teams and see what everyone answers and how they answer and take it from there. And actually, we're going to go into another breakout where I'd like everyone to use the voice silence calculator and consider which variables apply within your own organization or within your own team. Think about culture, demographics, power dynamics. How does this differ? And then share with the folks in your breakout room in terms of how this affects and may differ from your table. Victoria, Virginia, sorry, I called
Yep.
you Victoria. Is there a way to like share this screen in the breakouts? The logistics of that I didn't consider before.
Yeah, I can actually, yeah, let me see what I can do.
Okay.
I'm gonna do a screen grab and then I'll share it as an image in the chat.
Okay, I think that'll work.
See if this works. So once you get in there, if you just click on that image that I just threw into the chat, you'll be able to see that table. Does that work for everyone? When you click on it, Zena, can you see the image?
I can, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I have everyone set up. Again, we have 7 minutes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking that too.
I'll do that same one. Yep, perfect. I typed the first one, but this is a little bit more to type. Okay, so there's those 2 images in the chat. I have everyone divided out. I'll let you know when you're halfway through your time. So 7 minutes total, and I'll let you know when you have 1 minute left. Okay? Okay.
Thanks, Virginia.
No problem. Opening all rooms. And
hey, welcome back, everyone.
Yep, they're all back now.
Okay. Would anyone like to share some like unique things that they found in having this discussion of the breakdown? The table that I shared before, that one is also sometimes is really good at capturing like what can we change like within like the way that I'm approaching things, as opposed to thinking about it as like institution wide, which is why I like it. And so, but yeah, if anyone wants to share anything, feel free to drop it in the chat or just unmute yourself. Give everyone 30 seconds.
If I could just be a little bit honest, we weren't really sure what, like, the tie into the variables into the chart. So we just really didn't really know how to answer the question.
Okay. So like couldn't like know how to like fill in like the boxes, or
We knew how to fill in the boxes, but when
Okay.
you ask in the question the word variables, we just not sure where that fits into here.
Right. So for example, if we're talking about if we're answering the question, okay, like what happens if I use my voice, I'm who benefits the organization? Like what is it that's feeding that approach? So if I do speak out, I know that it'll benefit the organization. Is that tied to like my culture? Is that tied to like some stuff that my manager has done that has created a safe space? If the answer is nobody in this box, again, like what are some of the things that have led to me saying that? Like why am I saying that there would be some delay, for example, in like if I voice my opinion about something, the benefit would never occur. Then like what is the cause of that? Those are the variables or the factors that would lead into that we often, and those are the things that we often have to focus on, like shifting or changing, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. It's clear now. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, and again, this is sort of like a repeat of what I had just mentioned about like factors that can impact your ratio of voice. Um, and this will again really depend on your position within leadership and your position within the organization. But sometimes when it's like more about like coming at it from a personal perspective, there are things like fear of open conflict, because there's the reception of like the what's how things are being responded, but then there's the also individual responsibility piece, which again is part of why I like that exercise, is because sometimes it can help us even identify those things that we can focus on shifting. So if it is sometimes things like fear of open conflict, perfectionism as the expectation, or your primary lens of view, sense of urgency to meet deadlines, these things can be both a combination of a person and the institution and the culture, the right to comfort, and then defensiveness as like the go-to response to any types of like disrespectful disagreements or conflicts. So things to consider within ourselves and how we might be playing a part or not at all into the narrative around psychological safety. Okay, so in terms of how do we build and create psychological safety? So there are a number of factors that I'll go over. I'll try to do it as quickly as I can because we're sort of nearing the end, and I want to make sure that we have time at the end for questions. So these are all signs of psychologically safe space. They're comprehensive, and these are all things that can be measured as well. Like I mentioned, assessments are a really good piece, and a lot of the time when we do these comprehensive assessments with businesses and organizations, we're looking at these indicators, and these are all indicators of psychological safety. So we've got balance, like is your staff do they have work-life balance? Sometimes that means that, like, if it's possible that they might be working 10-hour days because it can be busier and like contracts and budget season or whatever. But then other days they're sort of taking shorter days, in the summer month, and that's generally accepted within the workplace. How are they balancing their work life? Are parents allowed to leave early for work, for example, to pick up their kids? Is that not even a question, kind of thing? These are all things that matter. Civility and respect. Is it a workplace that where employees are respectful and considerate of their interactions with one another? Clear leadership expectations. Do you feel like your expectations from your leader are clear? Are you able to deliver clear messaging around, like, hey, I expect this contract to be delivered with a certain quality assurance? And if it's not, that those conversations are being had before it's sort of too late. Engagement. Are the staff really feeling connected to the work? Growth and development. Is this a work environment where staff and employees feel like they have opportunities to grow? And it might not necessarily be in like promotions, but are they given other opportunities to explore different projects that they want to explore? Is there professional development that is offered to the staff? These are also things that tie in directly to engagement. Involvement and influence. Is your staff and other people at every level of the organization involved in some of the higher decision making within your organization? When you're writing a new policy, do you take input? Or if you're making some significant changes? I'm sure many people here have heard of the impact on post-secondary recently with the cuts to international students. So a lot of post-secondaries are facing really difficult times right now financially, and they're having to make some really significant decisions. Our president has been going on a listening tour to different faculties in different areas and just trying to hear from, like, where do people think that the most important cuts should be made? How are they feeling about the change? That's a really important, valuable input that allows staff to really feel like they can provide that perspective. Organizational culture, again, something that's shared with values of trust, honesty, and fairness. Protection of physical safety. I think with certain industries, like, are staff going in feeling like this is unsafe space? Are they given the right, materials, tools, and safety gear that they need to do their work effectively? Psychological competencies and demands. Is this a work environment where there's a good fit between employees' interpersonal and emotional competencies? Sometimes I think we promote leaders based on like stats and numbers. And a lot of the time, what ends up happening is you have leaders who are extremely efficient, but really lack those interpersonal skills and are abusive, honestly, to their staff. And so, are you promoting leaders who have a combination of those skills? Psychological protection, a work environment where employee psychological safety is ensured. And we'll talk about how to do that. Psychological and social supports. Is this a work environment where organizations are supportive of their employees' psychological health? Like, what does your benefit plan look like? If you need to take some time, there's a lot of wars going on right now, and there's, I don't know if anyone here is themselves, Iranian or has family in Iran. Like, have we reached out? What kind of support is being given to their staff? Sometimes it's really difficult to be able to. I'm Palestinian myself, and I think when for the last 2 years, there were days where it was really difficult to function when your family members are experiencing traumatic events globally and you're sort of trying to keep updated and stay connected. It impacts their ability to do the work. What kind of resources and support are we providing to staff so that they can just cope? And what does that look like? And sometimes it's just an acknowledgement, allowing them to just, like, hey, if you need to just sign off for the rest of the day or another couple of days, just let me know if there's anything I can take off your plate. We're here for you. And so those are environments that create that space for people to feel like they can do what they need to do to take care of their mental health. Recognition and reward. Do you recognize your staff's accomplishments? Sometimes award systems are good like that. Sometimes if you're a small organization, it's really just about like Friday night celebrations and like sending somebody like a dozen donuts, you know, or flowers or like edible arrangements or whatever. And then workload management, you know, and I think that goes back to the work-life balance, but also can lead to better engagement. I'm kind of zooming through these, but I will kind of quickly go over this and then I think we'll maybe wrap it up. So this is a leadership toolkit that essentially, and this is taken from, adapted from the Fearless Organization. So again, if you're super interested in like doing a deeper dive into this, I highly recommend the book and going through this for a deeper dive. But there's in terms of like setting the stage for psychological safety, there's a few key things that have to be done. One is setting the stage. And what that means is like creating the baseline environment so that staff know what to expect, know what they need, know how to deliver what they need to deliver. That involves setting clear expectations. Sometimes it's about having difficult conversations. Like if you have a staff member that was supposed to develop some sort of research report and it was due on Friday and now it's Wednesday and you sort of check in and there's like nothing there. Sometimes an honest conversation has to be had around like where some of the gaps have been, why some of that work hasn't, is it because they haven't been able to locate the resources? Is it because they haven't been able to write the content that they need to write? These conversations, and sometimes a job is not a good fit for somebody. And again, those conversations are really important to be had, providing them with the support. And if it comes to that point where the expectations just aren't being met, it is possible that the job might just not be a good fit. Emphasizing purpose. So when you ask people for certain things, like what do you ask, why those things are being collected and gathered, that's really important and allows people to get on board with all those things. Practice, acknowledge gaps and practice inquiry. So like asking questions, coming in from a place of curiosity often makes a huge shift. We see a lot of leaders come in and be like, just demanding people of things. And half the time they've already done those things or they already know those things, right? So coming at it from like a perspective of curiosity acknowledges the expertise in the room and also comes at it from like a space of humility. And then setting up structures and procedures, expressing appreciation. We talked about that a little bit. Destigmatizing failure. We also chatted about that a little bit to provide people with opportunities to experiment with things. This is a leadership self-assessment. We're just gonna pass it, but I will share the PDF and a link to this in the resources that Virginia is gonna send out so that you'll all have that in there as well, but you can take this. There's a lot of like self-assessments for leaders that are super comprehensive that I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in like leadership. An example of that is like the LCP 360 that looks at like collects data from direct reports and managers, and it's really comprehensive, ties into a lot of the competencies that we often look for with regards to equity, like equitable leadership. And this one is like a check mark that you just do on your own. So do that, but I also always highly recommend leaders to do those comprehensive leadership assessments. I'm gonna skip this slide because it just kind of goes over the importance of like, and so I'll speak to it very briefly. But you know, when it comes to psychological safety, there's two elements that really need to be married together. There's policies and documents. So like this is how you guarantee institutional reform. And sometimes it's about getting those things on paper, getting policies recognized and approved within institutions as a whole, and they create that lasting structure so that we're attracting the right kind of people. And they create a safety net in the event of where interpersonal relationships might fail. The soft power piece, I'm a political scientist, so I'll sometimes speak in language of power. But that is about like the interpersonal relationships, how we're interacting with one another, how we're supporting one another, that clarity piece, that communication piece. But sometimes that fails. Like you have leaders who are just toxic, for lack of better words, right? And when you have policies, that gives you a clear framework to come back to and to ensure that people who are being abused or facing discrimination or what have you can kind of go back to that space and have the assurances that then the institution can sort of prosper long term. So I'll say that about that. And then I just wanted to make sure that we had some time for questions before, and I see there is one in the chat. There's a few more. Okay, so there is one. Work-life balance and support. A more inclusive view would be, are the supports and work-life balance available to everyone, regardless of social and other statuses? We often neglect those who are since, and that there are over 45 armed conflicts happening in the world right now, for example. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, so I think it was more an observation when
Okay.
you were speaking to the conflicts that are going on in the world, and the fact that they're so that work-life balance. Like,
Acknowledges
I
that.
think it was more an observation, knowing that
Okay.
there's like more than 45 armed conflicts happening right now, so it might be something that you're not even
Yeah.
aware of.
Yeah.
Andrea, do you want to?
Sorry, I could speak to it. Yes. One of the things that you mentioned, in regards to work-life balance was like, do you enable a parent to leave work early because of an event? Well, one of the things as a single, never married person, are we afforded the same type of work-life balance? Like, oftentimes it's assumed that because we don't have a family, quote unquote, um, we can stay late and do extra work and that sort of thing. So just being aware of, when you're even creating policies and procedures, that you're being equitable to as many people as possible in terms of giving them the same options if needed. And it's the same thing in regards to support. Yes, there are conflicts that arise, but we often forget that there's also longer term conflicts that have been going on, and there's still that psychological and trauma in regards to those others as well. So just being mindful. There was a while there where we didn't talk about the war in Ukraine. Like, we provided so much support when it began, but then it dwindled. And the same thing happens with every single situation that arises. But how do we be consistent?
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think about like the policy piece where we ensure that those things are established, right? So when you have flexible like work arrangement policy, like, and ensuring that people have the ability to navigate their work around their life, whether it is children or it is elderly parents, or honestly, like crafts or like hobbies, like, and so I remember when I first started my job at the college maybe like 9 years ago. And the college is female led, and I really appreciated that because I remember in my interview I said something along the lines of like, I like to clock out at 2 because just my brain becomes mush at 2. I'm useless after 2 o'clock. So even just from like a neurodiversity piece, right? Is that like I'll be on, and at the time there was no COVID, there was no online work, so we was all in person. But I'd leave work at 2, and then later in the evenings I'd get a second wind, and so I would go back in and check emails, and I often worked a few hours on the weekends, and that just worked for me. It worked for my ability to navigate my own neurodivergence, and like, and it's about that. It's about creating the flexibility for people to be able to, and like if you have like I'm a writer, right? And so sometimes I like to take, a couple of hours in my day to just write. And so being able to like navigate and ensure that your work fits within your life, so long as and when those outcomes and those expectations are clear from your employer, then you can ensure that you are meeting those outcomes, that you're working towards that is sort of the priority. It's not about the like 9 to 5, and then I can fit that into all these other pieces of my life, into that. And so, and if we create policies that ensure that, then, you can create more opportunities for people to, and then and also modeling it, like leaders modeling that as well is really important.
Yeah. I had a question that came through during registration, and maybe this is just based on your experience through the institute and things that you've come across. So, can you expand on how to advocate for psychological safety in the for workplace policies re pregnancy loss?
Yeah. So, I think I saw that question and I had other questions, like clarifications. Because are we talking about like, does it, or, because I guess my questions are on, are we talking about mental health support or physical, like time off, right? Because I know that, when you have a child, you can go on mat leave and you get that like, in Canada, at least you get that like year to 18 months, whereas you don't with pregnancy loss. And so what are the supports available to that individual, whether it is through like sick days or health benefits? And I think that the first place to start would be to find an ally within the institution, whether it is, if it's not this person's leader, then it's trying to find another individual within the organization that has a little bit more of that leadership, that can be that spokesperson and help navigate. And then again, my other question was like, where does this person sit in their organization, right? To what level? So if you are tied to like HR or like, the people who develop the policies, then I would reach out to them. And if you are a member of them, begin that advocacy there. A lot of the time, like working groups are really great because like let's say you put together a committee on like just gender equity in your workplace, and this is brought up as an issue that can be then brought forward to the organization as like, hey, this is a real issue that's come up around. But if it is, coming back to it again, this is why I had so many questions about the question of like, if this is, a matter of like a person really struggling with like we're asking for and advocating for, whether it's mental health supports or whether it's time off as leave, the advice I would give is very different based on like, or are we advocating for like policy change or shifts in that? So I don't think I answered it, but I threw in a whole bunch of different things.
No, but I think that's helpful for them to look at how they would approach it, whether it is a policy change or whether it's in terms of when you're looking at reasons for absence and stuff, like whether it's bereavement, whether it's, maybe there needs to be something in there that has to do with pregnancy loss, but being sensitive to it in how it's labeled even, right?
Yeah.
I like the idea of taking it to a working group, or even like a women's resource group in your organization, as even just as a wide kind of overall discussion, where they could bring it to the leader who's running that group, and maybe escalate a little further to look at the different ways that you would support. And I mean, we're talking pregnancy loss, we're talking maternity leave, paternity leave, even adoption, like anything really surrounding children and loss of children as well. And maybe looking at that more closely, right?
Yeah. And maybe look at like the bereavement policy of the institution, like if they have one, right? And in theory, that should apply to this case as well. But again, I don't know the institution or the organization. And if they are really like, behind on a lot of these policies, then there's work to be done there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we are just about at time. So I just want to say thank you so much, Sina, to the group. Obviously, we will be sharing resources in our post-event email, as well as um, as the recording. I dropped in the chat. I dropped the Colbourne Institute into the chat there as well. And Zina's got this QR code here. And thank you very much. Really helpful to see all the different ways that, either as a leader or even as an employee, that you could take it to a resource group, and the different ways that they can look at psychological safety. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Virginia. And thanks to everyone who joined us today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the afternoon.